the shallow waters of the Venetian Lagoon, just a few miles from the crowded canals and tourist routes of Venice, lies a small abandoned island. From a distance, it appears unremarkable. Low buildings, overgrown trees, crumbling brick walls pressed quietly against the waterline. Boats pass nearby every day. Few stop. Its name is Poveglia. For centuries, this island has been sealed off from public life, not because of a single disaster or one dramatic event, but because of a long accumulation of history, disease, isolation, medicine, and abandonment, layered one era on top of another. Poveglia is often described in popular media as the most haunted island in the world. That description is easy. It is also misleading. The real story of Poveglia is not a horror story. It is something slower, heavier, and more uncomfortable. A story about how societies respond to fear, contagion, and human expendability. Unlike myths built on rumor, Poveglia's history is well documented. Its role during outbreaks of plague is recorded in Venetian archives. Its later use as a medical and psychiatric facility is supported by government records and hospital documentation. What remains uncertain is not what happened here, but how it felt to the people who were sent to this island, and why the island was never fully reclaimed afterward. We are going to examine Poveglia not as a place of ghosts, but as a place of policy, a place shaped by public health decisions, military control, and medical authority. We will separate legend from record, folklore from fact, and ask why this small island still occupies such a large space in the modern imagination. We begin not with madness or mystery, but with survival, and with Venice at the height of its power, facing an enemy it could not see. Before the plague, Poveglia's early life. Long before Poveglia became a place of isolation, it was simply a place to live. The earliest references to the island appear in medieval Venetian records, dating back to at least the 9th century. At that time, the Venetian Lagoon was not a backdrop for tourism or romance. It was a defensive environment, marshy, unstable, and difficult to navigate. Islands like Poveglia offered protection from invasions sweeping across mainland Italy. Historical documents indicate that small communities settled on Poveglia, farming the land and fishing the surrounding waters. It was not unique. Dozens of lagoon islands supported similar populations, forming a dispersed but resilient network tied closely to Venice's survival. By the Middle Ages, Venice had grown into a major maritime power. Its wealth depended on trade, ships arriving from the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa and Asia carrying spices, silk, grain, and people. That trade made Venice rich. It also made it vulnerable. With prosperity came risk. Ships did not only carry goods, they carried disease. Venetian authorities were among the first in Europe to understand that contagion could spread through contact and proximity. As early as the 14th century, Venice developed structured public health measures, isolation periods, health inspections, and designated quarantine zones. These were not acts of superstition, but of emerging medical reasoning, based on observation and pattern. Poveglia's location made it useful, close enough to Venice to control access, far enough to isolate what needed to be separated. By the late medieval period, the island began to shift in purpose. Residential life declined. Infrastructure associated with surveillance and control increased. Small fortifications were built. Watchtowers appeared. The island was no longer just a home. It was becoming a buffer. This transformation did not happen overnight. There was no single decree that condemned Poveglia to isolation. Instead, it happened gradually, as Venice refined its response to epidemics, and as fear became institutionalized. By the time Europe faced recurring waves of bubonic plague, Venice had already made a decision that would define Poveglia for centuries to come. The island was no longer meant for ordinary life. It was meant for containment, the plague years, quarantine, death, and control. By the time the Black Death reached Venice in the 14th century, the city was already accustomed to crisis. What it was not prepared for was scale. Between 1347 and 1351, waves of bubonic plague swept through Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. Venice, as one of the busiest ports in the world, stood directly in the path of contagion. Ships arrived daily from Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Levant. Many carried infected rats and fleas. Others carried sailors already dying. Venetian authorities responded with a level of organization that was unusual for the period. Rather than relying on prayer alone, they implemented systems of containment. Ships suspected of carrying disease were denied entry. Crews and passengers were removed and isolated. Goods were inspected, aired, or destroyed. This was the origin of quarantine as a public policy. The term itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, the length of isolation imposed on those suspected of exposure. Poveglia became one of the islands used for this purpose. Historical records indicate that during plague outbreaks, people showing symptoms were forcibly removed from Venice and transported to islands in the lagoon. Some were sick. Others were simply suspected. Families were separated. Decisions were made quickly, often without appeal. On Poveglia, the sick were housed in makeshift structures. There was little treatment to offer. Medieval medicine had no cure for plague. Physicians relied on bloodletting, herbal remedies, and isolation. For many, quarantine was not a path to recovery, but a delay before death. As outbreaks intensified, Poveglia's function expanded. The island was also used to receive bodies. Those who died in quarantine were buried or burned on site. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 20th century confirmed large quantities of human remains in the soil, consistent with mass burial practices from epidemic periods. Venetian health magistrates documented these operations meticulously. Death registers were kept. Transport routes were logged. Poveglia was not a place of chaos. It was a place of administration. But administration did not make it humane. Contemporary accounts describe the terror of removal, the sound of oars at night, the marking of doors, the silence that followed. Once sent to Poveglia, few returned. Survival depended on luck, timing, and the strength of the immune system. For many, quarantine was indistinguishable from a sentence. Over the following centuries, plague returned again and again. Venice experienced major outbreaks in 1575, 1577, and 1630, 1631, each killing tens of thousands. Each time, Poveglia was reactivated. Each time, the island absorbed the human cost of protecting the city. Gradually, the island's identity hardened. It was no longer seen as a former village or strategic outpost. It became a place associated exclusively with disease and death. Even after outbreaks subsided, people avoided it. Fishermen steered clear. No permanent population returned. By the time plague ceased to be a constant threat in the 18th century, Poveglia was already abandoned in practice, if not in law. Its buildings decayed. Its burial grounds were left undisturbed. The island had fulfilled its function. What remained was a problem Venice did not know how to solve. Because when the fear of contagion faded, Poveglia did not return to ordinary life. Instead, it would be repurposed once again, this time not for the containment of disease, but for the containment of people deemed unfit for society. The asylum, medicine, isolation, and authority. By the early 20th century, Poveglia had already lived several lives. It had been a settlement, a quarantine zone, and a mass burial ground. Each role ended the same way, abandonment. Yet the island was never erased from official records. It remained state property, and that made it available. In 1922, under the authority of the Italian government, Poveglia was repurposed again. This time it became a psychiatric hospital. Italy, like much of Europe, was undergoing a transformation in how it treated mental illness. Asylums were expanding rapidly. Psychiatry was professionalizing, but it was still deeply limited. Treatments were experimental. Diagnoses were broad. Institutionalization was often permanent. Poveglia was selected for a familiar reason: isolation. Separated from Venice by water, difficult to access, and already burdened by a history no one wished to remember. The island offered administrators something convenient: distance. Patients could be housed away from the public. Families could be reassured that their relatives were being treated. Society could look elsewhere. Official records confirm that a psychiatric facility operated on Poveglia throughout much of the interwar period. Patients were transported by boat and housed in existing structures adapted for medical use. The complex included wards, staff quarters, and observation areas. The bell tower, once used for maritime signaling, remained standing, a vertical landmark visible from the lagoon. What daily life on the island was like is harder to reconstruct. Medical files from the period are incomplete. Some were lost. Others were never made public. What remains are fragments, administrative documents, secondary reports, and testimonies collected decades later by journalists and historians. What is clear is the context in which this asylum functioned. Psychiatric care in early 20th century, Italy often emphasized control over cure. Patients could be committed for a wide range of reasons: severe mental illness, developmental disabilities, epilepsy, alcoholism, or behavior deemed socially disruptive. Discharge was rare. Oversight was minimal. Poveglia amplified all of this. Once admitted, patients were cut off not just from the city, but from visibility. There were no casual visitors, no passing observers. The island did not invite scrutiny. Whatever happened there remained there. Later, folklore would claim extreme abuses, secret experiments, sadistic doctors' mass killings. These claims, while popular, are not supported by verifiable evidence. No documentation confirms systematic torture or illegal experimentation, beyond the harsh realities, already common in asylums of the time. But the absence of proof does not imply comfort. Even under ordinary standards of the era, life in such institutions was bleak. Restraints were common, sedatives were overused. Patients were often treated as permanent residents rather than individuals with recoverable conditions. On Poveglia, these practices were reinforced by geography. Escape was impossible. Communication with the outside world was limited. The island itself enforced compliance. One figure appears repeatedly in later accounts: the hospital's chief physician. Stories describe him as authoritarian, isolated, increasingly unstable. According to legend, he eventually died after falling or jumping from the bell tower. There is no contemporary evidence to confirm this story. No death certificate, no official inquiry. No newspaper record has been found to substantiate it. Historians classify it as folklore, emerging decades later as the island's reputation darkened. Yet the persistence of the story is telling. It reflects not what can be proven, but what people believe could happen in a place like Poveglia, a place already associated with suffering, where power operated without witnesses. The psychiatric hospital was eventually closed. By the mid-20th century, changes in Italian mental health policy and the deteriorating condition of the island made continued operation impractical. Patients were transferred elsewhere. Staff left. Doors were locked. Once again, Poveglia was emptied. But this time something was different. The island was no longer simply unused. It was avoided. Officials discussed redevelopment and withdrew. Proposals were made and quietly abandoned. Poveglia remained in the public record, but outside public life, close enough to see, too burdened to reclaim. And as the island fell silent, stories began to grow louder. What followed was not history written in archives, but reputation built in absence, a space where documented facts thinned out, and imagination rushed in to fill the void. Abandonment, reputation, and the making of a forbidden place. When the psychiatric hospital on Poveglia closed in the mid-20th century, there was no ceremony, no public reckoning, and no official statement explaining the island's future. The patients were transferred. The staff departed. The buildings were sealed. And Poveglia was left behind. From a legal standpoint, the island remained property of the Italian state. From a practical standpoint, it became something else entirely, in a place without purpose. Unlike many former medical or military sites in Italy, Poveglia was never redeveloped. Its proximity to Venice should have made it valuable. Other lagoon islands were restored, repurposed, or converted into museums, residences, or cultural centers. Poveglia was not. Government documents and municipal records show repeated discussions about reuse throughout the second half of the 20th century. Proposals ranged from retirement facilities to research centers. None advanced beyond planning stages. The reasons were rarely stated explicitly, but the pattern was consistent: hesitation, withdrawal, silence. By the 1960s and 1970s, the island had become officially restricted. Public access was prohibited except with special permission, usually granted only for maintenance, surveying, or academic research. Boats were discouraged from docking. Signage warned against trespassing. At the same time, Poveglia began to re-enter public consciousness, not through policy, but through storytelling. Local legends circulated first. Fishermen spoke of strange sounds at night. Boatmen avoided the shoreline. These accounts were anecdotal, passed orally, and impossible to verify. They were not recorded in official sources, and historians treat them as folklore rather than evidence. What transformed these local stories into an international reputation was media. From the late 20th century onward, Poveglia appeared in travel writing, paranormal magazines, and later television programs focused on haunted locations. These portrayals often exaggerated or invented details, presenting legends as facts and collapsing centuries of history into a single narrative of terror. The island's real past, quarantine, mass death, psychiatric confinement, provided fertile ground for these interpretations. But it is important to draw a clear line. Claims of constant supernatural activity, aggressive apparitions, or physical harm to visitors are not supported by documented evidence. Journalists who visited the island legally, often accompanied by officials or historians, reported something far more mundane: decay, silence, and neglect. Buildings were unstable. Floors had collapsed. Vegetation overtook corridors and wards. Medical equipment, long obsolete, lay rusted and scattered. What unsettled observers was not an active presence, but the absence of care, the sense that an entire place had been left to dissolve without explanation. In 2014, Poveglia briefly returned to the political spotlight. As part of an initiative to reduce public debt, the Italian government opened the island to long-term lease proposals. The winning bid was made by an Italian entrepreneur, Luigi Brugnaro, who proposed restoring the site for private use. The lease was set for 99 years. The announcement reignited public debate. Some Venetians welcomed the idea of restoration. Others protested, arguing that Poveglia should remain a public memorial rather than a private property. Legal challenges and bureaucratic delays followed. More than a decade later, large-scale redevelopment has still not occurred. The island remains largely untouched. Access is still restricted. The structures continue to decay. What Poveglia has become is not officially defined, but socially understood. It is known as a place where the state once sent people it could not save, could not cure, or did not want to see. That reputation, built from documented suffering and amplified by myth, has proven more powerful than any redevelopment plan. And it raises a deeper question. When a place is shaped almost entirely by exclusion, quarantine, confinement, abandonment, what responsibility does society have to reclaim it? Or is leaving it untouched a form of acknowledgement? As Poveglia stands today, suspended between neglect and preservation, the line between history and legend grows increasingly blurred. What remains to be examined is not what the island is, but what people believe it represents, and why that belief has endured. Myths, media, and what can actually be proven. By the early 21st century, Poveglia had become something very different from what it once was. No longer a functioning institution or a site of policy. It existed primarily as an idea, shaped less by archives and more by repetition. The transformation was gradual but decisive. Television programs, blogs, and travel features increasingly framed Poveglia as a place of paranormal danger. It was labeled forbidden, cursed, and the most haunted island in the world. These descriptions traveled faster than historical nuance ever could. They were dramatic, memorable, and largely detached from evidence. What is often overlooked is that no Italian government agency, academic institution, or recognized historical body has ever classified Poveglia as dangerous due to supernatural causes. The island's restrictions have always been practical: structural instability, safety hazards, and preservation concerns. When journalists and historians are asked what makes Poveglia unusual, their answers are consistent. It is not the presence of unexplained phenomena. It is the concentration of documented suffering in a confined space, accumulated over centuries. Mass death during plague outbreaks is historically verified. Psychiatric confinement is historically verified. Long-term abandonment is historically verified. Everything else requires careful separation. Claims of constant screams, moving shadows, or physical attacks on visitors come almost entirely from modern paranormal entertainment programs. These shows rarely provide primary sources, medical documentation, or corroborated eyewitness testimony. Their purpose is atmosphere, not investigation. By contrast, legitimate researchers who have accessed Poveglia describe conditions that are unsettling for more grounded reasons. Floors weakened by decades of neglect. Sharp debris, asbestos remnants. Buildings at risk of collapse. The danger is real, but it is physical, not metaphysical. One recurring claim involves the island soil, that it is composed largely of human ash. Archaeological studies do confirm a high concentration of human remains, consistent with mass burial practices during plague periods. However, no credible study supports the idea that half the island is human remains, a figure often repeated without citation. Historians caution against numerical exaggeration. Plague victims were buried, burned, or both, but always as part of emergency public health measures, not ritualized disposal. The remains present on Poveglia are tragic, but not anomalous when compared to other European quarantine sites of the same era. Another persistent myth concerns secret medical experiments conducted during the asylum years. Once again, no surviving records support this claim. Italian psychiatric institutions of the early 20th century were often harsh and dehumanizing by modern standards, but they operated under known legal frameworks. When abuses occurred elsewhere, they left traces: court cases, reforms, public scandals. Poveglia has produced none. What exists instead is silence, and silence is often misinterpreted as concealment. In reality, silence can also be the result of bureaucracy, decay, and neglect, especially when a site no longer serves a function and no constituency exists to advocate for its preservation or study. This distinction matters because it reveals something broader about how modern societies interact with difficult history. Places like Poveglia become symbolic not because they hide secrets, but because they expose uncomfortable truths. They force confrontation with how easily people were isolated, removed, and forgotten in the name of public safety or medical order. As sensational stories multiplied, serious historical engagement diminished. The island's documented past was replaced by a simpler narrative: evil location, unexplained forces, forbidden ground. That narrative is easier to consume, but it also obscures the real lesson of Poveglia, and that ordinary administrative decisions made under pressure can leave marks that last far longer than the crisis that produced them. What remains unresolved is not whether Poveglia is haunted, but whether modern society is capable of facing places shaped by exclusion without transforming them into spectacle. And that question becomes even more pressing when we look at what has and has not been done with the island in recent years, despite renewed attention and opportunity. Modern era, ownership, access, and the boundary between fact and myth. By the late 20th century, Poveglia Island was no longer a functioning place. It was an abandoned asset, officially owned by the Italian state, quietly deteriorating and increasingly surrounded by rumor. After the psychiatric hospital closed in 1968, Poveglia was transferred between various government authorities. For decades, it remained unused. Buildings collapsed slowly, roofs caved in, medical wards, administrative rooms, and residential spaces were left exactly as they were. Beds rusting, walls peeling, corridors overtaken by vegetation. There was no formal preservation effort, no museum, no controlled access. This absence of oversight is important because it is precisely what allowed myth to grow. Contrary to popular claims, Poveglia was never officially declared forbidden by law. There is no document banning entry due to paranormal danger. What exists instead are maritime safety restrictions and structural hazard warnings issued by local authorities. The island's buildings are unstable, and much of the shoreline is unsafe for landing. These practical restrictions, however, were gradually reinterpreted by popular culture as something darker. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Poveglia began appearing in international media, travel books, television specials, and later internet forums, often described as the most haunted island in the world. These descriptions did not originate from academic historians or Italian archival sources. They emerged largely from secondary storytelling, repeated without verification. Claims began to circulate that half the soil is human ash. Doctors performed mass lobotomies. Thousands of patients were tortured and murdered. None of these statements are supported by primary evidence. Archaeological surveys have not concluded that the soil is primarily composed of human remains, while plague victims were buried or cremated on the island, a documented historical fact. The idea that the land itself is mostly ash is an exaggeration that cannot be substantiated by scientific analysis. Similarly, while lobotomy was a known psychiatric procedure in Europe during the mid-20th century, there is no archival proof that Poveglia was a major lobotomy center, nor that procedures there were uniquely cruel compared to other institutions of the same era. Italian medical records from the period are incomplete, but historians caution against assuming absence of documentation equals hidden atrocity. That distinction between what is unknown and what is invented is critical. In 2014, Poveglia briefly returned to the public spotlight when the Italian government attempted to lease the island to private developers for redevelopment. A group called Poveglia per Tutti, Poveglia for everyone, formed in response. Their goal was not to exploit the island's dark reputation, but to prevent privatization and push for public access and preservation. The group successfully raised funds and submitted a bid, although they did not ultimately gain control of the island. Their campaign revealed something important. Many Venetians do not view Poveglia as cursed or evil, but as a neglected historical site, representing uncomfortable chapters of public health, disease control, and psychiatric care. Journalists who have legally visited the island describe it not as frightening, but as profoundly quiet. There are no documented recordings of unexplained phenomena, no verified photographic evidence of apparitions, no official reports of abnormal activity filed by Italian authorities. What exists instead is something more subtle. Poveglia unsettles people because it represents systems, not monsters. It reflects how societies respond when faced with contagion, fear, and mental illness, how isolation becomes policy, how entire populations can be removed from view in the name of protection. The island's power does not come from ghosts. It comes from abandonment, and from the knowledge that everything that happened there was considered normal at the time. Today, access to Poveglia remains limited. It is occasionally visited by researchers, journalists, and officials with permission. The buildings continue to decay. Nature continues to reclaim the space. And online, the legends continue to grow, often louder than the facts. Which raises a final question that historians still grapple with. When a place carries centuries of documented suffering and is then left to rot in silence, does myth fill the gaps because the truth is already unsettling enough? What can be proven from what has been imagined? And ask why Poveglia's reputation endures, even when the evidence does not support the fear. Today, Poveglia stands as a physical reminder of how easily places of necessity become places of neglect, how medical progress often carries unseen human cost, and how history, when left unexamined, has a tendency to be rewritten by rumor instead of record. The fascination surrounding Poveglia says as much about us as it does about the island. We are drawn not only to mystery but to absence, not only to tragedy, but to what remains unacknowledged. Poveglia does not ask to be feared, it asks to be understood. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: once the legends are removed, what remains is still enough to make us uncomfortable, because it is real, documented, and deeply human. The island waits in the lagoon, unchanged, not haunted by ghosts, but by history still unfinished.